Goldfish Bowl by Robert A. Heinlein, originally published in the March 1942 issue of Astounding Science Fiction magazine, republished in a collection of the author's short stories entitled The Menace From Earth in 1959, read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Goldfish Bowl. On the horizon lay the immobile cloud which capped the incredible waterspouts known as the Pillars of Hawaii. Captain Blake lowered his binoculars. "There they stand, gentlemen." In addition to the naval personnel of the watch, the bridge of the hydrographic survey ship USS Mahan held two civilians. The captain's words were addressed to them. The elder and smaller of the pair peered intently through a spyglass he had borrowed from the quartermaster. "I can't make them out," he complained. "Here, try my glasses, Doctor," Blake suggested, passing over his binoculars. He turned to the officer of the deck and added, "Have the forward rangefinder manned, if you please, Mr. Mott." Lieutenant Mott caught the eye of the bosun's mate of the watch, listening from a discreet distance, and jerked a thumb upward. The petty officer stepped to the microphone, piped a shrill standby, and the metallic voice of the loudspeaker filled the ship, drowning out the next words of the captain. "Range 1, man and cast loose." "I asked," the captain repeated, "if that was any better." "I think I see them," Jacobson Graves acknowledged. "Two dark vertical stripes from the cloud to the horizon." "That's it." The other civilian, Bill Eisenberg, had taken the telescope when Graves had surrendered it for the binoculars. "I got 'em too," he announced. "There's nothing wrong with this scope, Doc, but they don't look as big as I'd expected," he admitted. "They're still beyond the horizon," Blake explained. "You see only the upper segments, but they stand just under 11,000 feet from waterline to cloud, if they're still running true to form." Graves looked up quickly. "Why the mental reservation? Haven't they been?" Captain Blake shrugged. "Sure, right on the nose, but they ought not to be there at all. 4 months ago they did not exist. How do I know what they will be doing today or tomorrow?" Graves nodded. "I see your point and agree with it. Can we estimate their height from the distance?" "I'll see." Blake stuck his head into the chart house. "Any reading, Archie?" "Just a second, Captain." The navigator stuck his face against a voice tube and called out, "Range!" A muffled voice replied, "Range 1, no reading." "Something greater than 20 miles, Blake told Graves cheerfully. "You'll have to wait, Doctor." Lieutenant Mott directed the quartermaster to make 3 bells. The captain left the bridge, leaving word that he was to be informed when the ship approached the critical limit of 3 miles from the pillars. Somewhat reluctantly, Graves and Eisenberg followed him down, and they had barely time enough to dress before dining with the captain. Captain Blake's manners were old-fashioned. He did not permit the conversation to turn to shop talk until the dinner had reached the coffee and cigars stage. "Well, gentlemen," he began as he lit up, "just what is it you propose to do?" "Didn't the Navy Department tell you?" Graves asked with a quick look. "Not much. I have had 1 letter directing me to place my ship in command at your disposal for research concerning the pillars, and a dispatch 2 days ago telling me to take you aboard this morning. No details." Graves looked nervously at Eisenberg, then back to the captain. He cleared his throat. We propose, Captain, to go up the Kanaka column and down the Wahine." Blake gave him a sharp look, started to speak, reconsidered, and started again. "Doctor, you'll forgive me, I hope. I don't mean to be rude, but That sounds utterly crazy. A fancy way to commit suicide. It may be a little dangerous. Humph! But we have the means to accomplish it if, as we believe to be true, the Kanaka column supplies the water which becomes the Wahine column on the return trip. He outlined the method. He and Eisenberg totaled between them nearly 25 years of bathysphere experience, 8 for Eisenberg, 17 for himself. They had brought aboard the Mahan, at present in an uncouth crate on the fantail, a modified bathysphere. Externally it was a bathysphere with its anchor weights removed. Internally it much more nearly resembled some of the complicated barrels in which foolhardy exhibitionists have essayed the spectacular, useless trip over Niagara Falls. It would supply air, stuffy but breathable, for 48 hours. It held water and concentrated food for at least that period. There were even rude but adequate sanitary arrangements. But its principal feature was an anti-shock harness, a glorified corset, a straitjacket in which a man could hang suspended clear of the walls by means of a network of Gideon cord and steel springs. In it, a man might reasonably hope to survive most violent pummeling. He could perhaps be shot from a cannon, bounced down a hillside, subjected to the sadistic mercy of a baggage smasher, and still survive with bones intact and viscera unruptured. Blake poked a finger at a line sketch with which Graves had illustrated his description. "You actually intend to try to ascend the pillars in that?" Eisenberg replied. "Not him, Captain, me." Graves reddened. "My damned doctor, and your colleagues," Eisenberg added. "It's this way, Captain. There's nothing wrong with Doc's nerve, but he has a leaky heart, a pair of submarine ears, and a set of not-so-good arteries. So the Institute has delegated me to kind of watch over him." "Now look here," Graves protested. "Bill, you're not going to be stuffy about this. I'm an old man. I'll never have another such chance." "No go," Eisenberg denied. "Captain, I wish to inform you that the Institute vested title of record to that gear we brought aboard in me, just to keep the old warhorse from doing anything foolish." "That's your pigeon," Blake answered testily. "My instructions are to facilitate Dr. Graves' research. Assuming that one or the other of you wish to commit suicide in that steel coffin, how do you propose to enter the Kanaka pillar?" "Why, that's your job, Captain. You put the sphere into the up column and pick it up again when it comes down the down column." Blake pursed his lips, then slowly shook his head. "I can't do that." "Huh? Why not?" "I will not take my ship closer than 3 miles to the pillars. The Mahan is a sound ship, but she is not built for speed. She can't make more than 12 knots. Someplace inside that circle, the surface current which feeds the Kanaka column will exceed 12 knots. I don't care to find out where by losing my ship. There have been an unprecedented number of unreported fishing vessels out of the islands lately. I don't care to have the Mahan listed. You think they went up the column?" "I do." "But look, Captain," suggested Bill Eisenberg, "you wouldn't have to risk the ship. You could launch the sphere from a power boat." Blake shook his head. "Out of the question," he said grimly. "Even if the ship's boats were built for the job, which they aren't, I will not risk naval personnel. This isn't war." "I wonder," said Graves softly. "What's that?" Eisenberg chuckled. "Doc has a romantic notion that all the odd phenomena turned up in the past few years can be hooked together into one smooth theory with a single sinister cause. Everything from the pillars to Lagrange's fireballs." "Lagrange's fireballs? How could there be any connection there? They're simply static electricity. Ali Sami, heat lightning. I know, I've seen 'em." The scientists were at once attentive. Graves' pique and Eisenberg's amusement alike buried in truth-tropism. You did? When? Where? Golf course at Hilo, last March. I was... That case! That was one of the disappearance cases. Yes, of course. I'm trying to tell you, I was standing in a sand trap near the 13th green when I happened to look up. A clear, balmy island day. No clouds, barometer, normal, light breeze. Nothing to suggest atmospheric disturbance. No maxima of sunspots. No static on the radio. Without warning, a half-dozen or more giant fireballs, ball lightning on an unprecedented scale, floated across the golf course in a sort of skirmish line, a line described by some observers as mathematically even, an assertion denied by others. A woman player, a tourist from the mainland, screamed and began to run. The flanking ball nearest her left its place in line and danced after her. No one seemed sure that the ball touched her. Blake could not say, although he had watched it happen, but when the ball had passed on, there she lay on the grass, dead. A local medico of somewhat flamboyant reputation insisted that he found evidence in the cadaver of both coagulation and electrolysis, but the jury that sat on the case followed the coroner's advice in calling it heart failure, a verdict heartily approved by the local Chamber of Commerce and Tourist Bureau. The man who disappeared did not try to run. His fate came to meet him. He was a caddy, a Japanese-Portuguese Kanaka mixed breed, with no known relatives, a fact which should have made it easy to leave his name out of the news reports had not a reporter smelled it out. He was standing on the green, not more than 25 yards away from me, Blake recounted, when the fireballs approached. One passed on each side of me. My skin itched and my hair stood up. I could smell ozone. I stood still. That saved you, observed Graves. Nuts, said Eisenberg. Standing in the dry sand of the trap was what saved him. Bill, you're a fool, Graves said wearily. These fireball things perform with intelligent awareness. Blake checked his account. Why do you assume that, Doctor? Never mind, for the moment, please. Go on with your story. Well, they passed on by me. The caddy fellow was directly in the course of one of them. I don't believe he saw it. Back toward it, you see. It reached him, enveloped him, passed on. But the boy was gone. Graves nodded. That checks with the accounts I have seen. Odd that I did not recall your name from the reports. I stayed in the background, Blake said shortly. Don't like reporters. Anything to add to the reports that did come out? Any errors in them? None that I can recall. Did the reports mention the bag of golf clubs he was carrying? I think not. They were found on the beach 6 miles away. Eisenberg sat up. That's news, he said. Tell me, was there anything to suggest how far they had fallen? Were they smashed or broken? Blake shook his head. They weren't even scratched, nor was the beach sand disturbed, but they were ice cold. Graves waited for him to go on. When the captain did not do so, he inquired, What do you make of it? Me? I make nothing of it. Well, how do you explain it? I don't. Unclassified electrical phenomena. However, if you want a rough guess, I'll give you one. The fireball is a static field of high potential. It englobes the caddy and charges him, whereupon he bounces away like a pith ball, electrocuted, incidentally. When the charge dissipates, he falls into the sea. So? There was a case like it in Kansas, rather too far from the sea. The body might simply never have been found. They never are, but even so, how do you account for the clubs being deposited so gently? And why were they cold? Damn it, man, I don't know. I'm no theoretician. I'm a maritime engineer by profession. an empiricist by disposition. Suppose you tell me. All right, but bear in mind that my hypothesis is merely tentative, a basis for investigation. I see in these several phenomena, the pillars, the giant fireballs, a number of other assorted phenomena which should never have happened, but did, including the curious case of a small mountain peak south of Boulder, Colorado, which had its tip leveled off spontaneously. I see in these things evidence of intelligent direction, a single conscious cause. He shrugged. Call it the X factor. I'm looking for X. Eisenberg assumed a look of mock sympathy. Poor old Doc, he sighed. Sprung a leak at last. The other two ignored the crack. Blake inquired, You are primarily an ichthyologist, aren't you? Yes. Well, how did you get started along this line? I don't know. Curiosity, I suppose. My boisterous young friend here would tell you that ichthyology is derived from icky. Blake turned to Eisenberg. But aren't you an ichthyologist? Hell no, I'm an oceanographer specializing in ecology. He's quibbling, observed Graves. Tell Captain Blake about Cleo and Pat. Eisenberg looked embarrassed. They're damned nice pets, he said defensively. Blake looked puzzled. Graves explained. He kids me, but his secret shame is a pair of goldfish. Goldfish! You'll find him in the wash basin in his stateroom this minute. Scientific interest? Blake inquired with a deadpan. Oh no, he thinks they're devoted to him. They're damned nice pets, Eisenberg insisted. They don't bark, they don't scratch, they don't make messes, and Cleo does so have expression. In spite of his initial resistance to their plans, Blake cooperated actively in trying to find a dodge whereby the proposed experiment could be performed without endangering naval personnel or material. He liked these two. He understood their curious mixture of selfless recklessness and extreme caution. It matched his own. It was professionalism as distinguished from economic motivation. He offered the services of his master diver, an elderly commissioned warrant officer, and his technical crew in checking their gear. You know, he added, there is some reason to believe that your bathysphere could make the round trip, aside from the proposition that what goes up must come down. You know of the VJ-14? Was that the naval plan lost in the early investigation? Yes. He buzzed for his orderly. Have my writer bring up the jacket on the VJ-14, he directed. Attempts to reconnoiter the strange permanent cloud and its incredible waterspouts had been made by air soon after its discovery. Little was learned. A plane would penetrate the cloud. Its ignition would fail. Out it would glide, unharmed, whereupon the engines would fire again. Back into the cloud. Engine failure. The vertical reach of the cloud was greater than the ceiling of any plane. The VJ-14, Blake stated, referring occasionally to the file jacket which had been fetched, made an air reconnaissance of the pillars themselves on May 12th, attended by the USS Pelican. Besides the pilot and radio man, she carried a cinematographer and a chief aerographer. Only the last two entries seem to be pertinent. Changing course will fly between the pillars 14 and 0913. Ship does not respond to controls 14. Telescopic observation from the Pelican shows that she made a tight upward spiral around the Kanaka pillar, about 1.5 turns, and was sucked into the column itself. Nothing was seen to fall. Incidentally, the pilot, Lieutenant Matson, was exonerated posthumously by the Court of Inquiry. Oh yes, here's the point pertinent to our question. From the log of the Pelican. 1709. Picked up wreckage identified as part of VJ-14. See additional sheet for itemized description. We needn't bother with that. Point is, they picked it up 4 miles from the base of the Wahine Pillar on the side away from the Kanaka. The inference is obvious, and your scheme might work. Not that you'd live through it. I'll chance it, Eisenberg stated. Yes, but I was going to suggest we send up a dead load. Say a crate of eggs packed into a hogshead. The buzzer from the bridge sounded. Captain Blake raised his voice toward the brass funnel of a voice tube in the overhead. Yes? 8 o'clock, Captain. 8 o'clock, lights and galley fires out. Prisoners secured. Thank you, sir. Blake stood up. We can get together on the details in the morning. A 50-foot motor launch bobbed listlessly astern the Mahan. A 9-inch coir line joined it to its mothership. Bound to it at fathom intervals was a telephone line ending in a pair of headphones worn by a signalman seated in the stern sheets of the launch. A pair of flags and a spyglass lay on the thwart beside him. His blouse had crawled up, exposing part of the lurid cover of a copy of Dynamic Tales, smuggled along as a precaution against boredom. Already in the boat were the coxswain, the engine man, the boat officer, Graves, and Eisenberg. With them, forward in the boat, was a breaker of water rations, 2 50-gallon drums of gasoline, and a hogshead. It contained not only a carefully packed crate of eggs, but also a jury-rigged smoke signal device armed 3 ways, delayed action set for 8, 9, and 10 hours, radio relay triggered from the ship, and simple saltwater penetration to complete an electrical circuit. The torpedo gunner in charge of diving hoped that one of them might work and thereby aid in locating the hogshead. He was busy trying to devise more nearly foolproof gear for the bathysphere. The boat officer signaled ready to the bridge. A megaphoned bellow responded, "Pay her out handsomely!" The boat drifted slowly away from the ship and directly toward the Kanaka Pillar, 3 miles away. The Kanaka Pillar loomed above them, still nearly a mile away, but loweringly impressive nevertheless. The place where it disappeared in cloud seemed almost overhead, falling toward them. Its 500-foot thick trunk gleamed purplish black, more like polished steel than water. "Try your engine again, coxswain." "Aye, aye, sir." The engine coughed, took hold. The engine man eased in the clutch, the screw bit in, and the boat surged forward, taking the strain off the tow line. "Slack line, sir." "Stop your engine." The boat officer turned to his passengers. "What's the trouble, Mr. Eisenberg? Cold feet?" "No, damn it. Seasick. I hate a small boat." "Oh, that's too bad. I'll see if we haven't got a pickle in that chow up forward." "Thanks, but pickles don't help me. Never mind, I can stand it." The boat officer shrugged, turned, and let his eye travel up the dizzy length of the column. He whistled, something which he had done every time he had looked at it. Eisenberg, made nervous by his nausea, was beginning to find it cause for homicide. "Whew! You really intend to try to go up that thing, Mr. Eisenberg?" "I do." The boat officer looked startled at the tone, laughed uneasily, and added, "Well, you'll be worse than seasick if you ask me." Nobody had. Graves knew his friend's temperament. He made conversation for the next few minutes. "Try your engine, coxswain." The petty officer acknowledged and reported back quickly, "Starter doesn't work, sir." "Help the engine man get a line on the flywheel. I'll take the tiller." The 2 men cranked the engine over easily, but got no answering cough. "Prime it." Still no results. The boat officer abandoned the useless tiller and jumped down into the engine space to lend his muscle to heaving on the cranking line. Over his shoulder, he ordered the signalman to notify the ship. Launch 3, calling bridge. Launch 3, calling bridge. Bridge, reply. Testing, testing. The signalman slipped a phone off one ear. Phone's dead, sir. Get busy with your flags. Tell 'em to haul us in. The officer wiped sweat from his face and straightened up. He glanced nervously at the current slapping against the boat's side. Graves touched his arm. How about the barrel? Put it over the side if you like. I'm busy. Can't you raise them, Sears? I'm trying, sir. Come on, Bill, Graves said to Eisenberg. The two of them slipped forward in the boat, threading their way past the engine on the side away from the three men sweating over the flywheel. Graves cut the hogshead loose from its lashings, then the two attempted to get a purchase on the awkward, unhandy object. It and its light load weighed less than 200 pounds, but it was hard to manage, especially on the uncertain footing of heaving floorboards. They wrestled it outboard somehow, with one smashed finger for Eisenberg, a badly banged shin for Graves. It splashed heavily, drenching them with sticky salt water, and bobbed astern. Carried rapidly toward the Kanaka pillar by the current which fed it. Ship answers, sir. Good. Tell them to haul us in, carefully. The boat officer jumped out of the engine space and ran forward, where he checked again the secureness with which the tow line was fastened. Graves tapped him on the shoulder. Can't we stay here until we see the barrel enter the column? No. Right now you'd better pray that that line holds instead of worrying about the barrel, or we go up the column too. Sears, has the ship acknowledged? Just now, sir. Why a coir line, Mr. Parker? Eisenberg inquired, his nausea forgotten in the excitement. I'd rather depend on steel or even good stout manila. Because coir floats and the others don't, the officer answered snappishly. 2 miles a line would drag us to the bottom. Sears, tell them to ease the strain. We're shipping water. Aye, aye, sir. The hogshead took less than 4 minutes to reach the column, enter it, a fact which Graves ascertained by borrowing the signalman's glass to follow it on the last leg of its trip, which action won him a dirty look from the nervous boat officer. Some minutes later, when the boat was about 500 yards farther from the pillar than it had been at nearest approach, the telephone came suddenly to life. The starter of the engine was tested immediately. The engine roared into action. The trip back was made with engine running to take the strain off the tow line, at half speed and with some maneuvering in order to avoid fouling the screw with the slack bright of the line. The smoke signal worked, one circuit or another. The plume of smoke was sighted 2 miles south of the Wahine pillar. Elapsed time from the moment the vessel had entered the Kanaka column, just over 8 hours. Bill Eisenberg climbed into the saddle of the exerciser in which he was to receive anti-Benz treatment. 30 minutes of hard work to stir up his circulation while breathing an atmosphere of helium and oxygen, at the end of which time the nitrogen normally dissolved in his bloodstream would be largely replaced by helium. The exerciser itself was simply an old bicycle mounted on a stationary platform. Blake looked it over. You needn't have bothered to bring this, he remarked. We've a better one aboard, standard practice for diving operations these days. We didn't know that, Graves answered. Anyhow, this one will do. All set, Bill? I guess so. He glanced over his shoulder to where the steel bulk of the bathysphere lay, uncrated, checked and equipped, ready to be swung outboard by the boat crane. Got the gasket sealing compound? Sure, the Iron Maiden is all right. The gunner and I will seal you in. Here's your mask. Eisenberg accepted the inhaling mask, started to strap it on, checked himself. Graves noticed the look on his face. What's the trouble, son? Doc, yes? I say, you'll look out for Cleo and Pat, won't you? Why, sure. But they won't need anything in the length of time you'll be gone. No, I suppose not, but you'll look out for 'em. Sure. Okay. Eisenberg slipped the inhaler over his face, waved his hand to the gunner waiting by the gas bottles. The gunner eased open the cutoff valves, the gas lines hissed, and Eisenberg began to pedal like a 6-day racer. With 30 minutes to kill, Blake invited Graves to go forward with him for a smoke and a stroll on the forecastle. They had completed about 20 turns when Blake paused by the Wildcat, took his cigar from his mouth, and remarked, "Do you know, I believe he has a good chance of completing the trip." "So? I'm glad to hear that." "Yes, I do, really. The success of the trial with the dead load convinced me. And whether the smoke gear works or not, if that globe comes back down the Wahine Pillar, I'll find it." "Yeah, I know you will. It was a good idea of yours to paint it yellow. Help us to spot it, all right. I don't think he'll learn anything, however. He won't see a thing through those ports but blue water from the time he enters the column to the time we pick him up." "Perhaps so. What else could he see?" "I don't know. Whatever it is that made those pillars, perhaps." Blake dumped the ashes from his cigar carefully over the rail before replying. "Doctor, I don't understand you. To my mind, those pillars are a natural, even though strange, phenomenon. And to me, it's equally obvious that they are not natural. They exhibit intelligent interference with the ordinary processes of nature as clearly as if they had a sign saying so hung on them. I don't see how you can say that. Obviously, they're not man-made." "No. Then who did make them, if they were made?" "I don't know." Blake started to speak, shrugged, and held his tongue. They resumed their stroll. Graves turned aside to chuck his cigarette overboard, glancing outboard as he did so. He stopped, stared, then called out, "Captain Blake!" "Eh?" The captain turned and looked where Graves pointed. "Great God! Fireballs!" "That's what I thought." "They're some distance away," Blake observed, more to himself than to Graves. He turned decisively. "Bridge!" he shouted. "Bridge! Bridge ahoy!" "Bridge! Aye, aye!" "Mr. Weems, pass the word. All hands below decks. Dog down all ports. Close all hatches. And close up the bridge itself. Sound the general alarm." "Aye, aye, sir." "Move!" Turning to Graves, he added, "Come inside." Graves followed him. The captain stopped to dog down the door by which they entered himself. Blake pounded up the inner ladders to the bridge, Graves in his train. The ship was filled with whine of the bosun pipe, the raucous voice of the loudspeaker, the clomp of hurrying feet, and the monotonous, menacing cling-cling-cling of the general alarm. The watch on the bridge were still struggling with the last of the heavy glass shutters of the bridge when the captain burst into their midst. "I'll take it, Mr. Weems," he snapped. In one continuous motion he moved from one side of the bridge to the other, letting his eye sweep the port side aft, the forecastle, the starboard side aft, and finally rest on the fireballs, distinctly nearer and heading straight for the ship. He cursed. "Your friend did not get the news," he said to Graves. He grasped the crank which could open or close the after starboard shutter of the bridge. Graves looked past his shoulder, saw what he meant. The afterdeck was empty, save for one lonely figure pedaling away on the stationary bicycle. The Lagrange fireballs were closing in. The shutter stuck, jammed tight, would not open. Blake stopped trying, swung quickly to the loudspeaker control panel, and cut in the whole board without bothering to select the proper circuit. "Eisenberg, get below!" Eisenberg must have heard his name called, for he turned his head and looked over his shoulder. Graves saw distinctly just as the fireball reached him. It passed on, and the saddle of the exerciser was empty. The exerciser was undamaged, they found, when they were able to examine it. The rubber hose to the inhaler mask had been cut smoothly. There was no blood, no marks. Bill Eisenberg was simply gone. "I'm going up." "You are in no physical shape to do so, Doctor." "You are in no way responsible, Captain Blake." "I know that. You may go if you like, after we have searched for your friend's body." "Search be damned. I'm going to look for him." "Huh? Eh? How's that?" "If you're right, he's dead, and there is no point in searching for his body. If I'm right, there is just an outside chance of finding him. Up there." He pointed toward the cloud cap of the pillars. Blake looked him over slowly, then turned to the master diver. "Mr. Hargreave, find an inhaler mask for Dr. Graves." They gave him 30 minutes of conditioning against the caisson disease, while Blake looked on with expressionless silence. The ship's company, bluejackets and officers alike, stood back and kept quiet. They walked on eggs when the old man had that look. Exercise completed, the diver crew dressed Graves rapidly and strapped him into the bathysphere with dispatch, in order not to expose him too long to the nitrogen in the air. Just before the escape port was dogged down, Graves spoke up. "Captain Blake?" "Yes, Doctor." "Bill's goldfish. Will you look out for them?" "Certainly, Doctor." "Thanks." "Not at all. Are you ready?" "Ready." Blake stepped forward, stuck an arm through the port of the sphere, and shook hands with Graves. "Good luck." He withdrew his arm. "Seal it up." They lowered it over the side. 2 motor launches nosed it half a mile in the direction of the Kanaka pillar, where the current was strong enough to carry it along. There they left it and bucked the current back to the ship, were hoisted in. Blake followed it with his glasses from the bridge. It drifted slowly at first, then with increased speed as it approached the base of the column. It whipped into rapid motion the last few 100 yards. Blake saw a flash of yellow just above the waterline, then nothing more. 8 hours, no plume of smoke. 9 hours, 10 hours, nothing. After 24 hours of steady patrol in the vicinity of the Wahine pillar, Blake radioed the Bureau. 4 days of vigilance. Blake knew that the bathysphere's passenger must be dead, whether by suffocation, drowning, implosion, or other means was not important. He so reported and received orders to proceed on duty assigned. The ship's company was called to quarters. Captain Blake read the service for the dead aloud in a harsh voice, dropped over the side some rather wilted hibiscus blooms, all that his steward could produce at the time, and went to the bridge to set his course for Pearl Harbor. On the way to the bridge, he stopped for a moment at his cabin and called to his steward. "You'll find some goldfish in the stateroom occupied by Mr. Eisenberg. Find an appropriate container and place them in my cabin." "Yes, sir, Captain." When Bill Eisenberg came to his senses, he was in a place. Sorry, but no other description is suitable. It lacked features. Oh, not entirely, of course. It was not dark where he was, nor was it in a state of vacuum, nor was it cold, nor was it too small for comfort. But it did lack features to such a remarkable extent that he had difficulty in estimating the size of the place. Consider stereovision, by which we estimate the size of things directly, does not work beyond 20 feet or so. At greater distances, we depend on previous knowledge of the true size of familiar objects, usually making our estimates subconsciously. A man so high is about that far away, and vice versa. But the place contained no familiar objects. The ceiling was a considerable distance over his head, too far to touch by jumping. The floor curved up to join the ceiling and thus prevented further lateral progress of more than a dozen paces or so. He would become aware of the obstacle by losing his balance. He had no reference lines by which to judge the vertical. Furthermore, his sense of innate balance was affected by the mistreatment his inner ears had undergone through years of diving. It was easier to sit than to walk, nor was there any reason to walk after the first futile attempt at exploration. When he first woke up, he stretched and opened his eyes, looked around. The lack of detail confused him. It was as if he were on the inside of a giant eggshell, illuminated from without by a soft, mellow, slightly amber light. The formless vagueness bothered him. He closed his eyes, shook his head, and opened them again. No better. He was beginning to remember his last experience before losing consciousness. The fireball swooping down, his frenzied, useless attempt to duck, the "hold your hats, boys" thought that flashed through his mind in the long, drawn-out split second before contact. His orderly mind began to look for explanations. Knocked cold, he thought, and my optic nerve paralyzed. Wonder if I'm blind for good. Anyhow, they ought not to leave him alone like this in his present helpless condition. "Doc!" he shouted. "Doc Graves!" No answer. No echo. He became aware that there was no sound, save for his own voice, none of the random little sounds that fill completely the normal, dead silence. This place was as silent as the inside of a sack of flour. Were his ears shot, too? No. He had heard his own voice. At that moment he realized that he was looking at his own hands. Why, there was nothing wrong with his eyes. He could see them plainly. And the rest of himself, too. He was naked. It might have been several hours later, it might have been moments, when he reached the conclusion that he was dead. It was the only hypothesis which seemed to cover the facts. A dogmatic agnostic by faith, he had expected no survival after death. He had expected to go out like a light with a sudden termination of consciousness. However, he had been subjected to a charge of static electricity more than sufficient to kill a man. When he regained awareness, he found himself without all the usual experience which makes up living. Therefore, he was dead. QED. To be sure, he seemed to have a body, but he was acquainted with the subjective-objective paradox. He still had memory. The strongest pattern in one's memory is body awareness. This was not his body, but his detailed sensation memory of it. So he reasoned. Probably, he thought, my dream body will slough away as my memory of the object body fades. There was nothing to do, nothing to experience, nothing to distract his mind. He fell asleep at last, thinking that if this were death, it was damned dull. He awoke refreshed, but quite hungry and extremely thirsty. The matter of dead or not dead no longer concerned him. He was interested in neither theology nor metaphysics. He was hungry. Furthermore, he experienced on awakening a phenomenon which destroyed most of the basis for his intellectual belief in his own death. It had never reached the stage of emotional conviction. Present there with him in the place, he found material objects other than himself, objects which could be seen and touched, and eaten. Which last was not immediately evident, for they did not look like food. There were two sorts. The first was an amorphous lump of nothing in particular, resembling a grayish cheese in appearance, slightly greasy to the touch and not appetizing. The second sort was a group of objects of uniform and delightful appearance. They were spheres, a couple of dozen. Each one seemed to Bill Eisenberg to be a duplicate of a crystal ball he had once purchased. true Brazilian rock crystal, the perfect beauty of which he had not been able to resist. He had bought it and smuggled it home to gloat over it in private. The little spheres were like that, in appearance. He touched one. It was smooth as crystal and had the same chaste coolness, but it was soft as jelly. It quivered like jelly, causing the lights within it to dance delightfully before resuming its perfect roundness. Pleasant as they were, they did not look like food, whereas the cheesy, soapy lump might be. He broke off a small piece, sniffed it, and tasted it tentatively. It was sour, nauseating, unpleasant. He spat it out, made a wry face, and wished heartily that he could brush his teeth. If that was food, he would have to be much hungrier. He turned his attention back to the delightful little spheres of crystal-like jelly. He balanced them in his palms, savoring their soft, smooth touch. In the heart of each he saw his own reflection, imagined in miniature, made elfin and graceful. He became aware almost for the first time of the serene beauty of the human figure, almost any human figure, when viewed as a composition and not as a mass of colloidal detail. But thirst became more pressing than narcissist admiration. It occurred to him that the smooth, cool spheres, if held in the mouth, might promote salivation, as pebbles will. He tried it. The sphere he selected struck against his lower teeth as he placed it in his mouth, and his lips and chin were suddenly wet while drops trickled down his chest. The spheres were water, nothing but water, no cellophane skin, no container of any sort. Water had been delivered to him, neatly packaged by some esoteric trick of surface tension. He tried another, handling it more carefully to ensure that it was not pricked by his teeth until he had it in his mouth. It worked. His mouth was filled with cool, pure water. Too quickly, he choked. But he had caught on to the trick. He drank 4 of the spheres. His thirst satisfied, he became interested in the strange trick whereby water became its own container. The spheres were tough. He could not squeeze them into breaking down, nor did smashing them hard against the floor disturb their precarious balance. They bounced like golf balls and came up for more. He managed to pinch the surface of one between thumb and fingernail. It broke down at once, and the water trickled between his fingers. Water alone, no skin nor foreign substance. It seemed that a cut alone could disturb the balance of tensions. Even wetting had no effect, for he could hold one carefully in his mouth, remove it, and dry it off on his own skin. He decided that, since his supply was limited and no more water was in prospect, it would be wise to conserve what he had and experiment no further. The relief of thirst increased the demands of hunger. He turned his attention again to the other substance and found that he could force himself to chew and swallow. It might not be food, it might even be poison, but it filled his stomach and stayed the pangs. He even felt well fed once he had cleared out the taste with another sphere of water. After eating, he rearranged his thoughts. He was not dead, or if he were, the difference between living and being dead was imperceptible, verbal. Okay, he was alive, but he was shut up alone. Somebody knew where he was and was aware of him, for he had been supplied with food and drink, mysteriously but cleverly. Ergo, he was a prisoner, a word which implies a warden. Whose prisoner? He had been struck by a Lagrange fireball and had awakened in his cell. It looked, he was forced to admit, as if Doc Graves had been right. The fireballs were intelligently controlled. Furthermore, the person or persons behind them had novel ideas as to how to care for prisoners, as well as strange ways of capturing them. Eisenberg was a brave man, as brave as the ordinary run of the race from which he sprang, a race as foolhardy as Pekingese dogs. He had the high degree of courage so common in the human race, a race capable of conceiving death, yet able to face its probability daily, on the highway, on the obstetrics table, on the battlefield, in the air, in the subway, and to face, lightheartedly, the certainty of death in the end. Eisenberg was apprehensive, but not panic-stricken. His situation was decidedly interesting. He was no longer bored. If he were a prisoner, it seemed likely that his captor would come to investigate him presently, perhaps to question him, perhaps to attempt to use him in some fashion. The fact that he had been saved and not killed implied some sort of plans for his future. Very well, he would concentrate on meeting whatever exigency might come with a calm and resourceful mind. In the meantime, there was nothing he could do toward freeing himself. He had satisfied himself of that. This was a prison which would baffle Houdini. Smooth, continuous walls, no way to get a purchase. He had thought once that he had a clue to escape. The cell had sanitary arrangements of some sort, for that which his body rejected went elsewhere. But he got no further with that lead. The cage was self-cleaning, and that was that. He could not tell how it was done. It baffled him. Presently, he slept again. When he awoke, one element only was changed. The food and water had been replenished. The day passed without incident, save for his own busy, fruitless thoughts, and the next day, and the next. He determined to stay awake long enough to find out how food and water were placed in his cell. He made a colossal effort to do so, using drastic measures to stimulate his body into consciousness. He bit his lips, he bit his tongue, he nipped the lobes of his ears viciously with his nails. He concentrated on difficult mental feats. Presently, he dozed off. When he awoke, the food and water had been replenished. The waking periods were followed by sleep, renewed hunger and thirst, the satisfying of same and more sleep. It was after the 6th or 7th sleep that he decided that some sort of a calendar was necessary to his mental health. He had no means of measuring time except by his sleeps. He arbitrarily designated them as days. He had no means of keeping records save his own body. He made that do. A thumbnail, shred, torn off, made a rough tattooing needle. Continued scratching of the same area on his thigh produced a red welt, which persisted for a day or two and could be renewed. 7 welts made a week. The progression of such welts along 10 fingers and 10 toes gave him the means to measure 20 weeks, which was a much longer period than he anticipated any need to measure. He had tallied the second set of 7 thigh welts on the ring finger of his left hand when the next event occurred to disturb his solitude. When he awoke from the sleep following said tally, he became suddenly and overwhelmingly aware that he was not alone. There was a human figure sleeping beside him. When he had convinced himself that he was truly wide awake, his dreams were thoroughly populated. He grasped the figure by the shoulder and shook it. "Doc!" he yelled. "Doc, wake up!" Graves opened his eyes, focused them, sat up, and put out his hand. "Hi, Bill," he remarked. "I'm damned glad to see you." "Doc," he pounded the older man on the back. "Doc, for criminy sake, you don't know how glad I am to see you. I can guess. Look, Doc, where have you been? How did you get here? Did the fireballs snag you too?" "One thing at a time, son. Let's have breakfast." There was a double ration of food and water on the floor near them. Graves picked up a sphere, nicked it expertly, and drank it without losing a drop. Eisenberg watched him knowingly. "You've been here for some time." "That's right. Did the fireballs get you the same time they got me?" No. He reached for the food. I came up the Kanaka pillar. What? That's right. Matter of fact, I was looking for you. The hell you say? But I do say. It looks as if my wild hypothesis was right. The pillars and the fireballs are different manifestations of the same cause. X. It seemed almost possible to hear the wheels whir in Eisenberg's head. But, Doc, look here. Doc, that means your whole hypothesis was correct. Somebody did the whole thing. Somebody has us locked up here now. That's right. He munched slowly. He seemed tired, older and thinner than the way Eisenberg remembered him. Evidence of intelligent control. Always was. No other explanation. But who? Some foreign power? Are we up against something utterly new in the way of an attack? Humph. Do you think the Russians, for instance, would bother to serve us water like this? He held up one of the dainty little spheres. Who then? I wouldn't know. Call them Martians. That's a convenient way to think of them. Why Martians? No reason. I said that was a convenient way to think of them. Convenient how? Convenient because it keeps you from thinking of them as human beings, which they obviously aren't, nor animals. Something very intelligent, but not animals, because they're smarter than we are, Martians. But, wait a minute. Why do you assume that your ex-people aren't human? Why not humans who have a lot of stuff on the ball that we don't have? New scientific advances? That's a fair question, Graves answered, picking his teeth with a forefinger. I'll give you a fair answer, because in the present state of the world, we know pretty near where all the best minds are and what they're doing. Advances like these couldn't be hidden and would be a long time in developing. X indicates evidence of a half a dozen different lines of development that are clear beyond our ken and which would require years of work by hundreds of researchers, to say the very least. Ipso facto, non-human science. Of course, he continued, if you want to postulate a mad scientist and a secret laboratory, I can't argue with you, but I'm not writing any Sunday supplements. Bill Eisenberg kept very quiet for some time while he considered what Graves said in the light of his own experience. You're right, Doc, he finally admitted. Shucks, you're usually right when we have an argument. It has to be Martians. Oh, I don't mean inhabitants of Mars. I mean some form of intelligent life from outside this planet. Maybe. But you just said so. No, I said it was a convenient way to look at it. But it has to be, by elimination. Elimination is a tricky line of reasoning. What else could it be? I'm not prepared to say just what I do think yet, but there are stronger reasons than we have mentioned for concluding that we are up against non-humans. Psychological reasons. What sort? X doesn't treat prisoners in any fashion that arises out of human behavior patterns. Think it over. They had a lot to talk about, much more than X, even though X was a subject they were bound to return to. Graves gave Bill a simple, bald account of how he happened to go up the pillar, an account which Bill found very moving for what was left out rather than told. He felt suddenly very humble and unworthy as he looked at his elderly, frail friend. Doc, you don't look well. I'll do. That trip up the pillar was hard on you. You shouldn't have tried it. Graves shrugged. I made out all right. But he had not. And Bill could see that he had not. The old man was poorly. They slept, and they ate, and they talked, and they slept again. The routine that Eisenberg had grown used to alone continued, save with company, but Graves grew no stronger. Doc, it's up to us to do something about it. About what? The whole situation. This thing that has happened to us is an intolerable menace to the whole human race. We don't know what may have happened down below. What do you say down below? Why, you came up the pillar. Yes, true, but I don't know when or how I was taken out of the bathysphere, nor where they may have taken me. But go ahead, let's have your idea. Well, but okay, we don't know what may have happened to the rest of the human race. The fireballs may be picking them off one at a time with no chance to fight back, and no way of guessing what has been going on. We have some idea of the answer. It's up to us to escape and warn them. There may be some way of fighting back. It's our duty. The whole future of the human race may depend on it. Graves was silent so long after Bill had finished his toxin that Bill began to feel embarrassed, a bit foolish. But when he finally spoke, it was to agree. I think you're right, Bill. I think it quite possible that you are right. Not necessarily, but distinctly possible. And that possibility does place an obligation on us to all mankind. I've known it. I knew it before we got into this mess, but I did not have enough data to justify shouting, "Wolf!" The question is, he went on, how can we give such a warning now? We've got to escape. Ah, there must be some way. Can you suggest one? Maybe. We haven't been able to find any way in or out of this place, but there must be a way. Has to be. We were brought in. Furthermore, our rations are put inside every day somehow. I tried once to stay awake long enough to see how it was done, but I fell asleep. So did I. Uh-huh. I'm not surprised. But there are two of us now. We could take turns. Watch on and watch off until something happened. Graves nodded. It's worth trying. Since they had no way of measuring the watches, each kept the vigil until sleepiness became intolerable, then awakened the other. But nothing happened. Their food ran out, was not replaced. They conserved their water balls with care, were finally reduced to one which was not drunk because each insisted on being noble about it. The other must drink it. But still no manifestation of any sort from their unseen captors. After an unmeasured and unestimated length of time, but certainly long, almost intolerably long, at a time when Eisenberg was in a light, troubled sleep, he was suddenly awakened by a touch and the sound of his name. He sat up, blinking, disoriented. What's the matter? I must have dozed off, Graves said miserably. I'm sorry, Bill. Eisenberg looked where Graves pointed. Their food and water had been renewed. Eisenberg did not suggest a renewal of the experiment. In the first place, it seemed evident that their keepers did not intend for them to learn the combination to their cell and were quite intelligent enough to outmaneuver their necessarily feeble attempts. In the second place, Graves was an obviously sick man. Eisenberg did not have the heart to suggest another long, grueling, half-starved vigil. But, lacking knowledge of the combination, it appeared impossible to break jail. A naked man is a particularly helpless creature, lacking materials wherewith to fashion tools. He can do little. Eisenberg would have swapped his chances for eternal bliss for a diamond drill, an acetylene torch, or even a rusty second-hand chisel. Without tools of some sort, it was impressed on him that he stood about as much chance of breaking out of his cage as his goldfish, Cleo and Patra, had of chewing their way out of a glass bowl. Doc. Yes, son? We've tackled this the wrong way. We know that X is intelligent. Instead of trying to escape, we should be trying to establish communication. How? I don't know, but there must be some way. But if there was, he could never conjure it up. Even if he assumed that his captors could see and hear him, how was he to convey intelligence to them by word or gesture? Was it theoretically possible for any non-human being, no matter how intelligent, to find a pattern of meaning in human speech symbols if he encountered them without context, without background, without pictures, without pointing? It is certainly true that the human race, working under much more favorable circumstances, had failed almost utterly to learn the languages of the other races of animals. What should he do to attract their attention, stimulate their interest? Recite the Gettysburg Address? Or the multiplication table? Or if he used gestures, would deaf and dumb language mean any more, or any less, to his captors than the sailor's hornpipe? "Doc." "What is it, Bill?" Graves was sinking. He rarely initiated a conversation these days. "Why are we here?" "I've had it in the back of my mind that eventually they would take us out and do something with us. Try to question us, maybe, but it doesn't look like they meant to." "No, it doesn't." "Then why are we here? Why do they take care of us?" Graves paused quite a long time before answering. "I think that they are expecting us to reproduce." "What?" Graves shrugged. "But that's ridiculous." "Surely, but would they know it?" "But they are intelligent." Graves chuckled, the first time he had done so in many sleeps. "Do you know Roland Young's little verse about the flea? 'A funny creature is the flea, you cannot tell the she from he, but he can tell, and so can she.' After all, the visible differences between men and women are quite superficial and almost negligible, except to men and women." Eisenberg found the suggestion repugnant, almost revolting. He struggled against it. "But look, Doc, even a little study would show them that the human race is divided up into sexes. After all, we aren't the first specimens they've studied." "Maybe they don't study us." "Huh? Maybe we're just pets." Pets. Bill Eisenberg's morale had stood up well in the face of danger and uncertainty. This attack on it was more subtle. Pets. He had thought of Graves and himself as prisoners of war, or possibly objects of scientific research, but pets? "I know how you feel," Graves went on, watching his face. It's humiliating from an anthropocentric viewpoint, but I think it may be true. I may as well tell you my own private theory as to the possible nature of X and the relation of X to the human race. I haven't up to now, as it is almost sheer conjecture based on very little data, but it does cover the known facts. I conceive of the X creatures as being just barely aware of the existence of men, unconcerned by them and almost completely uninterested in them." "But they hunt us." "Maybe. Or maybe they just pick us up occasionally by accident. A lot of men have dreamed about an impingement of non-human intelligences on the human race. Almost without exception, the dream has taken one of two forms: invasion and war, or exploration and mutual social intercourse. Both concepts postulate that non-humans are enough like us either to fight with us or talk to us, treat us as equals, one way or the other. I don't believe that X is sufficiently interested in human beings to want to enslave them or even exterminate them. They may not even study us, even when we come under their notice. They may lack the scientific spirit in the sense of having a monkey-like curiosity about everything that moves. For that matter, how thoroughly do we study other life forms? Did you ever ask your goldfish for their views on goldfish poetry or politics? Does a termite think that a woman's place is in the home? Do beavers prefer blondes or brunettes?" "You are joking." "No, I'm not. Maybe the life forms I mentioned don't have such involved ideas. My point is, if they did or do, we'd never guess it. I don't think X conceives of the human race as intelligent. Bill chewed this for a while, then added, "Where do you think they came from, Doc? Mars, maybe, or clear out of the solar system?" "Not necessarily, not even probably. It's my guess that they came from the same place we did, from up out of the slime of this planet." "Really, Doc? I mean it. And don't give me that funny look. I may be sick, but I'm not balmy. Creation took 8 days. Huh? I'm using biblical language. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And so it came to pass. But nobody mentioned the stratosphere." "Doc, are you sure you feel all right? Damn it, quit trying to psychoanalyze me. I'll drop the allegory. What I mean is, we aren't the latest nor the highest stage in evolution. First the oceans were populated, then lungfish to amphibian, and so on up, until the continents were populated, and in time, man ruled the surface of the earth, or thought he did. But did evolution stop there? I think not. Consider, from a fish's point of view, air is a hard vacuum. From our point of view, the upper reaches of the atmosphere, 60, 70, maybe 100,000 feet up, seem like a vacuum and unfit to sustain life. But it's not vacuum. It's thin, yes, but there's a matter there and radiant energy. Why not life, intelligent life, highly evolved as it would have to be, but evolved from the same ancestry as ourselves and fish? We wouldn't see it happen. Man hasn't been aware, in a scientific sense, that long. When our granddaddies were swinging in the trees, it had already happened." Eisenberg took a deep breath. "Just wait a minute, Doc. I'm not disputing the theoretical possibility of your thesis, but it seems to me it is out on direct evidence alone. We've never seen them, had no direct evidence of them, at least not until lately, and we should have seen them." "Not necessarily. Do ants see men? I doubt it." "Yes, but, consarn it, a man has better eyes than an ant." "Better eyes for what?" "For his own needs. Suppose the X creatures are too high up, or too tenuous, or too fast-moving for us to notice them. Even a thing as big and as solid and as slow as an airplane can go up high enough to pass out of sight, even on a clear day. If X is tenuous and even semi-transparent, we never would see them, not even as occultations of stars, or shadows against the moon, though as a matter of fact there have been some very strange stories of just that sort of thing." Eisenberg got up and stomped up and down. "Do you mean to suggest," he demanded, "that creatures so insubstantial they can float in a soft vacuum built the pillars?" "Why not? Try explaining how a half-finished naked embryo like Homo sapiens built the Empire State Building." Bill shook his head. "I don't get it." "You don't try. Where do you think this came from?" Graves held up one of the miraculous little water spheres. "My guess is that life on this planet is split 3 ways, with almost no intercourse between the 3. Ocean culture, land culture, and another, call it stratoculture, maybe a 4th down under the crust, but we don't know. We know a little about life under the sea because we're curious, but how much do they know of us? Do a few dozen bathysphere descents constitute an invasion? A fish that sees our bathysphere might go home and take to his bed with a sick headache, but he wouldn't talk about it, and he wouldn't believe if he did. If a lot of fish see us and swear out affidavits, along comes a fish psychologist and explains it as mass hallucination. No, it takes something at least as large and solid and permanent as the pillars to have any effect on orthodox conceptions. Casual visitations have no real effect." Eisenberg let his thoughts simmer for some time before commenting further. When he did, it was half to himself. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. Believe what? Your theory. Look, Doc, if you're right, don't you see what it means? We're helpless. We're outclassed. I don't think they'll bother much with human beings. They haven't, up till now. But that isn't it, don't you see? We've had some dignity as a race. We've striven and accomplished things. Even when we failed, we had the tragic satisfaction of knowing that we were, nevertheless, superior and more able than the other animals. We've had faith in the race. We would accomplish great things yet. But if we are just one of the lower animals ourselves, what does our great work amount to? Me, I couldn't go on pretending to be a scientist if I thought I was just a fish mucking around in the bottom of a pool. My work wouldn't signify anything. Maybe it doesn't. No, maybe it doesn't. Eisenberg got up and paced the constricted area of their prison. Maybe not, but I won't surrender to it. I won't. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're wrong. It doesn't seem to matter very much where the X people came from. One way or the other, they are a threat to our own kind. Doc, we've got to get out of here and warn them. How? Graves was comatose a large part of the time before he died. Bill maintained an almost continuous watch over him, catching only occasional cat naps. There was little he could do for his friend, even though he did watch over him, but the spirit behind it was comfort to them both. But he was dozing when Graves called his name. He woke at once, though the sound was a bare whisper. "Yes, Doc?" "I can't talk much more, son. Thanks for taking care of me." "Shucks, Doc." "Don't forget what you're here for. Someday you'll get a break. Be ready for it and don't muff it. People have to be warned." "I'll do it, Doc. I swear it." "Good boy." And then, almost inaudibly, "Good night, son." Eisenberg watched over the body until it was quite cold and had begun to stiffen. Then, exhausted by his long vigil and emotionally drained, he collapsed into a deep sleep. When he woke up, the body was gone. It was hard to maintain his morale after Graves was gone. It was all very well to resolve to warn the rest of mankind at the first possible chance, but there was the endless monotony to contend with. He had not even the relief from boredom afforded the condemned prisoner, the checking off of limited days. Even his calendar was nothing but a counting of his sleeps. He was not quite sane much of the time, and it was the twice tragic insanity of intelligence, aware of its own instability. He cycled between periods of elation and periods of extreme depression, in which he would have destroyed himself, had he the means. During the periods of elation, he made great plans for fighting against the X creatures after he escaped. He was not sure how or when, but momentarily he was sure. He would lead the crusade himself. Rockets could withstand the dead zone of the pillars and the cloud. Atomic bombs could destroy the dynamic balance of the pillars. They would harry them and hunt them down. The globe would once again be the kingdom of man, to whom it belonged. During the bitter periods of relapse, he would realize clearly that the puny engineering of mankind would be of no force against the powers and knowledge of the creatures who built the pillars, who kidnapped himself and Graves in such a casual and mysterious a fashion. They were outclassed. Could Codfish plan a sortie against the city of Boston? Would it matter if the chattering monkeys in Guatemala passed a resolution to destroy the Navy? They were outclassed. The human race had reached its highest point, the point at which it began to be aware that it was not the highest race, and the knowledge was death to it. One way or the other. The mere knowledge alone, even as the knowledge was now destroying him, Bill Eisenberg himself. Eisenberg, homo piscis. Poor fish. His overstrained mind conceived a means by which he might possibly warn his fellow beings. He could not escape as long as his surroundings remained unchanged. That was established, and he accepted it. He no longer paced his cage, but certain things did leave his cage: leftover food, refuse, and Graves' body. If he died, his own body would be removed, he felt sure. Some, at least, of the things which had gone up the pillars had come down again. He knew that. Was it not likely that the X-creatures disposed of any heavy mass for which they had no further use by dumping it down the Wahini pillar? He convinced himself that it was so. Very well. His body would be returned to the surface, eventually. How could he use it to give a message to his fellow men, if it were found? He had no writing materials, nothing but his own body. But the same make-do means which served him as a calendar gave him a way to write a message. He could make welts on his skin with a shred of thumbnail. If the same spot were irritated over and over again, not permitted to heal, scar tissue would form. By such means he was able to create permanent tattooing. The letters had to be large. He was limited in space to the fore part of his body. Involved argument was impossible. He was limited to a fairly simple warning. If he had been quite right in his mind, perhaps he would have been able to devise a more cleverly worded warning, but then he was not. In time, he had covered his chest and belly with cicatrix tattooing worthy of a Bushman chief. He was thin by then and of an unhealthy color. The welts stood out plainly. His body was found floating in the Pacific by Portuguese fishermen who could not read the message, but who turned it into the harbor police of Honolulu. They, in turn, photographed the body, fingerprinted it, and disposed of it. The fingerprints were checked in Washington, and William Eisenberg, scientist, fellow of many distinguished societies, and high type of Homo sapiens, was officially dead for the second time, with a new mystery attached to his name. The cumbersome course of official correspondence unwound itself, and the record of his reappearance reached the desk of Captain Blake at a port in the South Atlantic. Photographs of the body were attached to the record, along with a short official letter telling the captain that, in view of his connection with the case, it was being provided for his information and recommendation. Captain Blake looked at the photographs for the dozenth time. The message told in scar tissue was plain enough. Beware. Creation took 8 days. But what did it mean? Of one thing he was sure. Eisenberg had not had those scars on his body when he disappeared from the Mahan. The man had lived for a considerable period after he was grabbed up by the fireball, that was certain, and he had learned something. What? The reference to the first chapter of Genesis did not escape him. It was not such as to be useful. He turned to his desk and resumed making a draft in painful longhand of his report to the Bureau. The message in scar tissue adds to the mystery rather than clarifying it. I am now forced to the opinion that the pillars and the Lagrange fireballs are connected in some way. The patrol around the pillars should not be relaxed. If new opportunities or methods for investigating the nature of the pillars should develop, they should be pursued thoroughly. I regret to say that I have nothing of the sort to suggest. He got up from his desk and walked to a small aquarium supported by gimbals from the inboard bulkhead and stirred up the 2 goldfish therein with a forefinger. Noticing the level of the water, he turned to the pantry door. Johnson, you filled this bowl too full again. Pat's trying to jump out again. I'll fix it, Captain. The steward came out of the pantry with a small pan. Don't know why the old man keeps these tarnation fish. He ain't interested in 'em, that's certain. Aloud, he added, That patfish don't want to stay in there, Captain. Always trying to jump out, and he don't like me, Captain. What's that? Captain Blake's thoughts had already left the fish. He was worrying over the mystery again. I say that fish don't like me, Captain. Tries to bite my finger every time I clean out the bowl. Don't be silly, Johnson.